When I felt his hands on my waist, measuring tape pulled taut across my blouse, my breath caught, not because it was wrong, but because it felt more real than anything had in years. I told myself it was just fabric, just measurements, just practicality. But my body reacted like it remembered something I had long buried. His fingers brushed the inside of my arm as he noted the sleeve length, and I shivered, not from cold. I knew it wasn't supposed to be this way. He was my father. Not by blood, but by years of quiet presence, repairs, and birthday calls. He had been there when no one else stayed. When my real father disappeared, and when my husband began to fade into the shadows of our shared house. But the measuring tape didn't know family roles, and my skin didn't recognize boundaries when they were crossed with gentleness. I could feel the slow pulse in my neck, and I was certain he did too. He didn't speak, and neither did I, but the silence between us grew louder than any excuse I could ever make. My phone buzzed on the table, breaking the moment. I stepped back quickly, almost stumbling, whispering something about traffic and errands. He only nodded. But that night, as I lay beside the man I married, who didn't even notice I hadn't spoken in hours, I realized something had already shifted. And I was afraid. Not of what might happen, but of what had already begun. Let me tell you what really happened. Before you judge me, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and be honest. Have you ever crossed a line in silence, not with words, but with a glance, a pause, a breath you didn't take? There's a kind of loneliness that doesn't scream. It just waits. It doesn't demand or accuse, it lingers, soft and unnoticed, in the background of a life that looks fine from the outside. My husband and I had a functional marriage. Not perfect, not broken. Just present. Like two pieces of furniture in the same room. Useful. Predictable. We shared calendars, bills, and the occasional joke, but affection had become optional and touch had become rare. I didn't blame him. He was a good man. Kind. Steady. But I'd stopped feeling like a woman around him a long time ago. The realization didn't hit me suddenly. It arrived in small, forgettable moments, when he'd pass by me in the hallway without a glance, or when I'd reach for his hand in bed and find only sheets. It didn't hurt anymore. That was the worst part. I had grown numb to being unseen. It started with a conversation I had with a friend over coffee. She had just returned from Paris, glowing with stories and a silk scarf she claimed changed her entire outlook. She looked at me and said, "You used to love colors. You used to care how you looked." I laughed, brushing her off, but her words stuck. That night, I stood in front of the mirror, not looking for beauty, just for traces of the woman I used to be. That's when I thought of him. My father, not by birth, but by choice. He had come into my life when I was 13, married my mother, and stayed. He wasn't affectionate, but he was reliable. He repaired things. Shelves. Cars. Silences. After my mother passed, we stayed in touch, though not often. When I married, he kept his distance, out of respect. But every birthday, there was a card. Every winter, he'd ask if we needed help with the heating. He used to sew. Not professionally, but well. My high school dress, a few coats. I remembered how he took measurements with an almost surgical focus, quiet and exact. That memory came back to me like a photograph pulled from a dusty box. Without overthinking, I called him. "Do you still sew?" I asked. He paused. "Some things." "Why?" I was thinking of having something made. Something simple. For myself. He didn't ask questions. He just said, "Come by. I'll need your measurements." I didn't tell my husband. Not because I was hiding something. just because it didn't seem relevant. He wouldn't have noticed anyway. That morning, he was buried in work emails, sipping cold coffee. I told him I'd be out for errands, and he nodded without looking up. The drive to my father's house was familiar but foreign. The streets hadn't changed much, but I felt different moving through them, as if I were floating, half unreal, already divided between who I was and who I was about to become. His house was quiet, as always. Clean but lived in. The smell of cedar and machine oil hung in the air. The sewing room hadn't changed in years. Spools of thread, folded fabrics, a heavy wooden table that had held every garment he'd ever made. I ran my fingers across it like I was reading Braille from an old story I forgot I was part of. He didn't say much. Just took out the measuring tape, motioned for me to stand. I removed my coat. He asked me to face the wall, arms slightly out. His touch was professional, steady, quick, detached. But my body betrayed me. I felt every point of contact like a drop of ink on water, spreading slow and wide. My breath shallowed. I clenched my fists to hide the tremble. He didn't say anything, but I sensed it. Something flickered in him too. Not desire. Not lust. Just awareness. Like two people realizing they're not where they thought they were. When he touched my shoulder to mark a seam, I flinched, not away, but toward. It was involuntary. He paused. I didn't move. Then he stepped back, slowly. We both stood still for a long second. A second full of everything unsaid, everything unspoken over years of quiet proximity. My phone buzzed. A sharp, real-world sound. I blinked, like waking from a dream. I muttered something about needing to go. He nodded. I grabbed my coat, didn't look back. The drive home was a blur. My heart wasn't racing, it was sinking. Like I had crossed something I couldn't see, and now there was no map back. When I got home, my husband was in the living room, eyes on his laptop. You were gone a while, he said, not unkindly. Traffic, I replied. He nodded. That was it. That night, I stood under the shower for a long time, letting the water hide the confusion on my face. I didn't do anything wrong. And yet, something had changed. Inside me. Between us. I lay beside my husband, feeling the distance like a body between us. He was breathing evenly, already asleep. I turned to face the window. My body still remembered his touch, my father's. Not sexual. Not romantic. Just deeply, dangerously human. Something had started. And I wasn't sure I could stop it. The morning light filtered through the curtains in streaks, highlighting the dust in the air, floating like memories I hadn't invited. My husband was already gone. His side of the bed was cold, undisturbed. I sat up slowly, my body heavy but alert. There was a weight on my chest, not panic, not guilt, something quieter, more enduring. A question with no answer. I had crossed no lines, not really. But inside me, something felt different. Shifted. I went through the motions of my morning, brushing my hair, applying makeup I rarely bothered with anymore. I stared at my reflection. Not for beauty. For proof. That I was still myself. My phone vibrated on the dresser. A message from him. Just one line, I made some adjustments to the pattern. If you have time today, I'd like to check the shoulder measurements again. I stared at the screen. My thumb hovered, uncertain. I typed sure and sent it. Then I stood there, staring at the reply bubble that never came. I didn't need one. At breakfast, I poured coffee, burned the toast, and threw it away. I wasn't hungry. My hands trembled slightly as I rinsed the plate, the water too hot. I dried them slowly, methodically, grounding myself in the ordinary. Driving to his house felt different this time. Not wrong, just conscious. As if each turn, each stoplight, carried a layer of thought I couldn't remove. I parked, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment, letting the silence build. Then I got out, my heels clicking on the concrete with deliberate rhythm. He opened the door before I could knock. As if he'd been waiting. He stepped aside, didn't speak. I walked in, hung my coat on the hook by instinct, and followed him to the sewing room. The table was cleared, fabric folded in neat stacks. The measuring tape was already laid out. He gestured for me to stand by the mirror. I did. He picked up a piece of chalk and began marking light lines on the paper pattern pinned to the form. I think the shoulder slope needs to be adjusted, he said quietly. I nodded. No further explanation needed. He stepped closer, his hand resting lightly on my upper back, guiding me to stand straighter. I complied. The measuring tape brushed against my collarbone. His fingers adjusted the angle, and I felt a familiar sensation rise, not desire, not fear. Awareness. Again. He moved behind me, aligning the fabric. I could feel his breath, steady and close. My skin prickled under the cotton of my blouse. The tape circled my torso, resting just under my arms. His hand hesitated, briefly, at the side of my ribs. Not inappropriately. Just long enough for both of us to feel the pause. And then, we kissed. I don't know how it happened. I don't remember moving, or turning. Just the proximity, the weight of silence, and suddenly, we kissed. Not urgently. Not even deeply. Just enough to make the world around us stop. It ended as quickly as it began. I stepped back. He looked at me, but said nothing. I turned away, hands shaking slightly. The measuring tape dropped to the floor between us. I bent to pick it up, fingers trembling, and handed it to him. He took it, careful not to touch my skin. I should go, I whispered, barely audible. He nodded once, without protest. I walked out of the room, down the hall, and reached for my coat. My fingers caught on the hook. I paused, collected myself, and then left. The air outside felt colder than before. I sat in the car, staring at my hands on the wheel. They were pale, the knuckles tight. I took a breath, then another, waiting for my heartbeat to settle. It didn't. Driving home felt like moving through water, thick, slow, disorienting. I replayed everything. The chalk lines. The silence. The touch. The kiss. I told myself it meant nothing, that it was just confusion. Loneliness. That it would fade. But I knew better. When I arrived, the house was quiet. My husband wouldn't be home until evening. I walked into the kitchen, filled a glass of water, and sat at the table. My phone buzzed again. A message from him. Just 2 words, "I'm sorry." I stared at it, unmoving. I didn't respond. Later, I cooked dinner without appetite. Stirred the sauce, boiled the pasta, chopped vegetables too finely. It was mechanical. The door opened, and he walked in, loosened his tie, and placed his briefcase on the floor. "Smells good," he said. "Pasta," I replied. We ate in silence. He talked about meetings, a potential promotion, something his boss said. I nodded, added a comment where necessary, smiled at the right places. I was there. But only in body. That night, in bed, he reached out. Not forcefully. Just a hand on my waist, tentative. I tensed. Not out of rejection, but confusion. I didn't move. Eventually, his hand slid away. He fell asleep. I did not. I lay awake, listening to the hum of the refrigerator down the hall, the occasional car passing by outside. My mind played the scene over again. The room. The air. The silence. The kiss. I didn't feel guilty. That scared me more than anything. I didn't feel elated either. Just shaken. Like a mirror had cracked and I wasn't sure which reflection was real. Was I the woman who had kissed her father? No. Not her father. A man who had filled that role, yes. But not by blood. Not even by affection, in the usual sense. Just presence. Time. History. Still, it was wrong. And yet, undeniably alive. I thought about calling him. About asking what it meant, what he felt. But I knew it didn't matter. It wasn't about him. It was about me. About something missing, long before this moment. About a hunger I didn't know I still had. Sometime after midnight, I got out of bed and walked to the living room. I sat on the couch, knees to chest, wrapped in a blanket. The quiet wrapped around me. I didn't cry. I didn't move. I just sat. And wondered what would come next. I woke before the sun rose, wrapped in a blanket on the living room couch. My neck ached from sleeping upright, and the weight of what had happened the day before sat heavy on my chest. The air felt stale, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath with me. The quiet was different now, no longer peaceful, but observant. Like the silence itself knew something had changed. I moved slowly through the kitchen, making coffee out of habit, not desire. The scent filled the room, grounding me, giving me something real to cling to. I didn't drink it right away. I just held the mug, letting the warmth bleed into my fingers. My husband came downstairs later, already dressed for work. He looked tired, distracted, like someone trying to remember what they'd forgotten. "You okay?" he asked, his tone casual, almost automated. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Just didn't sleep well." He kissed my cheek, lightly, distantly, and left. The door clicked shut behind him, and I was alone again. I spent most of that morning cleaning. Not because the house needed it, but because I didn't know what else to do. I dusted picture frames we hadn't looked at in years. Wiped down countertops twice. Rearranged books that didn't need rearranging. I found myself lingering over a photo from our early marriage. We looked younger, yes, but also lighter. There was something in my smile I hadn't seen in years. Something real. I wasn't angry at him. That would have made things easier. There was no abuse, no betrayal on his part. Just absence. A slow erosion of connection until we were coexisting in parallel routines. We were good at pretending. Most couples were, I guessed. Mid-afternoon, I received a package. A small, flat envelope with no return address. I opened it cautiously. Inside was a piece of fabric. Soft gray silk, folded perfectly. No note. No explanation. But I knew who it was from. I ran my fingers over the material. It was beautiful, understated. There was an intimacy in the gesture, offering texture instead of words. I placed it on the kitchen table, stared at it, unsure whether to keep it or throw it away. In the end, I did neither. I needed air. I grabbed my coat and keys and drove without a destination. The city blurred past my window, shops, pedestrians, stoplights. None of it registered. My mind was fixed elsewhere, turning over questions I couldn't name. Eventually, I parked near the park where we used to take weekend walks before life became routine. I got out, wrapped my scarf tighter, and walked along the path, letting the cold settle into my lungs. I found a bench near the lake and sat, watching the water ripple with the breeze. Ducks floated lazily across the surface, oblivious to the chaos I felt inside. Around me, people passed, some with strollers, others in pairs. I wondered how many of them were pretending to. A woman sat on the far end of the bench, older, wearing a red wool coat and gloves. She didn't speak. Just nodded politely before looking out at the lake. We sat in silence for several minutes. There was comfort in her presence, in the anonymity. I returned home just before dusk. The house looked the same, but it felt different. Or maybe I did. That evening, my husband came home with a bottle of wine. He set it on the table like it was some kind of offering. I thought we could have dinner together, he said, unsure. I hesitated. Okay. We ate pasta and salad, made small talk about his work. He mentioned a colleague's retirement, a change in leadership, traffic on the highway. I nodded, responded where expected. I don't think he noticed how quiet I really was. After dinner, he offered to do the dishes. That surprised me. I watched him rinse plates, stack them carefully. When he finished, he turned to me, drying his hands on a towel. You've been somewhere else lately, he said, finally acknowledging it. In your head, I mean. I didn't answer right away. He waited. I'm just tired, I said. A lot on my mind. He nodded slowly. If you want to talk, I'm here. I appreciated that. Truly. But I didn't know how to explain what I didn't fully understand myself. That night, I didn't sleep. Again. I lay awake, listening to the sounds of the house, creaking floors, the ticking clock in the hallway, the occasional groan of pipes behind the walls. At one point, I got up and returned to the kitchen. The silk fabric was still on the table. I picked it up, held it to my cheek, then set it down again. I was craving meaning where there might not be any. I found myself wondering about the girl in the photo I had discovered in his studio once, years ago. A child with soft eyes and his jawline. I had never asked. Never wanted to disrupt the quiet order of our family's structure. But the question returned now, sharp and sudden. Who was she? What story had remained untold? The next morning, I drove back to his house, not impulsively, but with intent. I needed clarity, not contact. When he opened the door, he looked surprised but not unsettled. He stepped aside without a word. We sat in the sewing room. No tape. No fabric. Just two chairs and a table between us. The air was still. I got your package, I said quietly. He nodded. It wasn't a message. Just something I thought you might like. I don't know what to do with it, I admitted. You don't have to do anything. That sat between us like a stone. Heavy, immovable. I shifted in my seat. I found a photo once. A little girl. She had your eyes. He looked at me, something unreadable in his expression. Yes. She's yours? He didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he nodded. I didn't know what to do with that either, I said, softer now. He leaned back, sighed. Not everything has a place. Some things just exist. Quietly. I left not long after. No embrace. No repeat of what happened before. Just silence. But this time, it wasn't charged. It was resolution. On the drive home, I felt both heavier and lighter. There were no answers. But at least now I knew where the questions belonged. That night, I sat with my husband in the living room, watching a movie neither of us really paid attention to. He reached over, took my hand in his, and didn't let go. I didn't pull away. We didn't speak. But maybe, for now, that was enough. The following days passed in an odd rhythm, neither normal nor abnormal, simply muted. I went through each one like stepping stones over still water, careful not to make ripples. My husband remained consistent in his way, perhaps sensing something had shifted but choosing not to confront it. Or maybe he preferred the silence. I didn't know. And I didn't ask. I focused on the little things. Organizing drawers that had been untouched for years, rereading old journals, baking loaves of bread I didn't want to eat. The actions grounded me. They gave me the illusion of control, as if by keeping my hands busy, I could keep my thoughts from slipping out of reach. But the thoughts came anyway, especially in the quiet moments. I found myself remembering the expression on his face when I asked about the girl in the photograph. It wasn't regret. It was resignation. As if he had accepted long ago that some parts of life simply don't get explained. There was something haunting in that. The idea of unspoken truths not as secrets, but as weights we carry indefinitely. Quiet burdens that form the architecture of who we are. One afternoon, as I sat folding laundry in the living room, I came across a sweater I hadn't worn in years. Tucked into the sleeve was a receipt, faded, crumpled, barely legible. It was from a small fabric shop near the edge of town, dated back at least a decade. I remembered the place vaguely. I had gone there once with him, years ago, helping him choose materials for a coat he was repairing. The memory came back clear, how he had run his fingers over the fabric slowly, as if listening with his skin. How he had turned to me and asked what I thought of a particular shade of navy, and how I had smiled and nodded, even though I didn't really care about the color. I just liked being asked. Impulsively, I decided to drive there. I told my husband I had errands to run, an easy truth. He barely looked up from his screen. The fabric shop was still there, tucked between a hardware store and a florist, its sign faded but intact. I parked across the street and watched it for a moment, as if expecting it to vanish. Inside, the shop was quiet. Dust motes danced in the sunlight pouring through the front windows. The woman behind the counter looked up and offered a soft smile. She didn't recognize me, which didn't surprise me. I wandered through the aisles, touching rolls of fabric without really seeing them. Everything felt familiar and foreign at once. The scent of cotton and dye stirred something in me, an echo of something I couldn't name. I didn't buy anything. I just stood there for a long time, and then left. Driving home, I took the long way. Not to avoid anything. Just to delay returning to a house that no longer felt like a home. Not entirely. I passed the old library where I used to take our daughter. The school she had attended. The cafe where we had celebrated our 10th anniversary with coffee and dry cake. Landmarks of a life that had happened to me more than through me. When I got back, the house was empty. My husband had left a note on the table. Dinner with coworkers. Back late. I stared at it longer than necessary before folding it in half and placing it in the drawer. That evening, I opened a box of old photographs. Not out of nostalgia, but because I was searching for something, though I didn't know what. Most of the pictures were faded, yellowed at the edges. Birthdays. Vacations. Blurred snapshots of moments we were supposed to remember. And then I found one. It was of him, my father. He was younger, but his eyes were the same. Focused. Grounded. Next to him was a woman I didn't recognize. She had her hand on his arm, her expression unreadable. There was something oddly intimate in their pose, not romantic, but deeply familiar. I turned the photo over. No date. No names. I stared at it for a long time, then set it aside. Later that week, he called. His voice was calm, as always. "I'm going out of town," he said. "A few days. Old friend needs help with something. Thought you should know." I thanked him for letting me know, and we said goodbye without anything resembling closure. After the call, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at my reflection in the darkened window. I tried to see myself as I had been a year ago. 5 years ago. I couldn't. That woman was gone. Not because of one moment or one kiss, but because of 1,000 quiet sacrifices made over time, choices to stay quiet, to accommodate, to shrink. It was in that moment that I realized what I truly feared, not discovery, not confrontation, but invisibility. The idea that I could live an entire life and never be fully seen. That weekend, my husband suggested we go out for dinner. Just the two of us. It had been a while. I agreed. We chose a restaurant we hadn't been to in years. It was a safe place, a familiar menu, neutral lighting. We ordered wine, made small talk, and pretended things were normal. But something in his eyes told me he knew. Not specifics, but something. Halfway through the meal, he reached across the table and touched my hand. "I feel like I'm losing you," he said softly. I didn't answer right away. I looked at his hand on mine, felt the warmth of it, the familiarity. "You're not," I said finally. "But I'm trying to find myself." He nodded, slowly, his face unreadable. "I want to help." "I don't think you can," I replied. "Not because you don't care. But because I don't know what I need yet." That was the most honest thing I'd said in months. We finished dinner quietly. Drove home in silence. But it wasn't a heavy silence this time. It was spacious, uncertain, but open. That night, I stood at the window in our bedroom, looking out at the neighborhood. Lights flickered on and off in other homes. Lives continuing in parallel. And I wondered how many women like me were standing in their windows too, wondering where they'd gone, and if they could ever come back. The week moved forward, not with urgency but with an almost mechanical sense of progression. I returned to work, engaged in conversations with neighbors, answered emails, and did all the things expected of someone living an ordinary life. But underneath, there was an undeniable tension in my body, a sense of being pulled in opposite directions, one rooted in duty, the other in something I hadn't yet named aloud. I had been drifting for so long that I barely recognized the version of myself that had begun to take shape in the quiet moments. One morning, a letter arrived in our mailbox. Not a bill, not a flyer, but a handwritten envelope with my name written in neat, deliberate print. There was no return address, no postmark I could identify. I took it inside, placed it on the kitchen counter, and stared at it for nearly 20 minutes before opening it. Inside was a folded sheet of paper. A note, brief, precise. "I'm back in town. I left something for you in the workshop." No expectations. Only honesty. That was it. No signature, though one wasn't needed. I placed the letter back in the envelope and tucked it into a drawer. I didn't act on it right away. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table, my fingers wrapped around a lukewarm mug of tea, watching the shadows move across the walls. I wasn't afraid of seeing him again. But I was afraid of what it would mean if I did. That evening, I mentioned to my husband that I might visit an old family friend who needed help organizing a few things. He nodded, barely looking up from his laptop. I felt a small pang in my chest, not guilt, but something adjacent. Perhaps grief for the space that had grown between us without either of us noticing. The next day, I made the drive out to the workshop. The sky was overcast, and the road seemed quieter than usual. When I arrived, the place looked untouched, as though time had held it in suspension until I returned. I let myself in with the key he had given me long ago, under the pretense of practicality, in case of emergencies. At the time, it had felt innocent. Now, it felt like a symbol of a door I had already opened long before I understood what was behind it. Inside, the room was warm with a faint scent of cedar and oil. The lights were off, but enough daylight filtered through the windows to illuminate the space. On the work table was a large sheet draped over something rectangular. A note was placed beside it. For her, not the version she pretends to be. I lifted the sheet carefully. Underneath was a dress, simple, elegant, in a soft gray that shimmered only when the light hit it just right. I ran my fingers along the seams, noticing the familiar precision in every stitch. It was my size, my shape, my style, but more than that, it felt like it had been made for who I truly was beneath all the layers I wore for others. I didn't try it on. Not yet. Instead, I sat on the bench near the window and looked out across the small yard behind the workshop. The trees were bare, their branches stretching upward like arms. For a moment, I allowed myself to breathe fully, without performing for anyone. It wasn't about him. Not entirely. It was about what he represented, a version of myself that hadn't been defined by being a wife, or a mother, or a daughter. A woman who existed not for someone else's comfort, but for her own quiet strength. As I sat there, I heard the soft sound of footsteps behind me. I turned. He stood in the doorway, not surprised to see me, but not expectant either. He said nothing. Neither did I. We sat in the same room, separated by 5 feet of air and 10 years of shared silence. I didn't move. I didn't speak. And then, we kissed. It wasn't planned. It wasn't dramatic. It was brief. Measured. A punctuation mark in the stillness between us. And yet it carried a weight that years of words never could. When it ended, we both stepped back, not out of fear, but understanding. The air was heavier now, not with regret, but with the gravity of what couldn't be undone. I looked at him, his face older than I remembered, but still the same in all the ways that mattered. He nodded once, slowly, and I turned and walked out. Back in the car, my hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I sat in the driveway, trying to collect the pieces of myself that had scattered somewhere between arrival and departure. I didn't start the engine right away. I closed my eyes and tried to remember how it felt to be untouched by consequence. When I got home, the house was dark. My husband had left a message on the counter. He'd gone to visit his brother and would be back later that night. I read it twice, wondering how many more messages would be exchanged on pieces of paper instead of across the dinner table. I placed the envelope from the morning alongside it, then went upstairs. In the bedroom, I opened the closet and pushed aside the clothes I rarely wore. I placed the new dress carefully among them, its fabric catching the light for just a moment before settling into the shadows. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the occasional creak of the floorboards as the house settled. At one point, I got up and walked to the window, looking out at the empty street. I imagined the versions of myself walking in opposite directions, one toward safety, routine, predictability. The other toward something uncertain, but honest. I wasn't sure which one I wanted to follow. I only knew I couldn't stay still much longer. In the silence of the room, I whispered to no one, I don't know how to come back from this. But even as I said it, I wondered if I truly wanted to. The next few days unfolded in silence, not the kind born from distance, but the kind shaped by deliberate choice. I moved through them slowly, each task calculated, each moment suspended in a strange calm. There was no panic, no racing heartbeat, just the strange hum of detachment that often follows after something irreversible has occurred. I felt like I was floating above my life, watching myself go through the motions, folding towels, preparing dinner, answering polite questions with polite answers. I didn't return to the workshop, and he didn't reach out. That absence became its own kind of presence. I carried it with me everywhere, in the tension of my shoulders, in the way I avoided mirrors, in the tightness of my chest whenever I walked past the closet where the gray dress now hung. My husband noticed the shift, though he didn't name it. He grew more attentive, perhaps sensing something had changed but not knowing how or why. He started asking about my day again, offering to help with chores he usually avoided. His efforts were small but sincere, and I found myself resenting them in ways I didn't want to admit. Not because he was doing anything wrong, but because now it felt too late. One evening, we were sitting in the living room, the television playing some quiet drama we both weren't watching. He looked over at me and asked if I'd like to take a weekend trip, just the two of us. We could go to the lake house, he said, his voice hopeful, almost tentative. I paused, weighing my response carefully. I didn't want to reject him. I didn't want to hurt him. But I also didn't want to keep pretending. Still, I nodded. Okay, I said. That sounds nice. He smiled, relieved. I smiled too, but it didn't reach as far as it should have. That night, as I lay in bed beside him, I stared at the ceiling, listening to his breathing, steady and soft. He was trying. And I was failing. Not intentionally. Just inevitably. The following morning, I began to pack. I kept it simple, comfortable clothes, a coat, my journal. I considered bringing the gray dress but stopped myself. It didn't belong in that setting. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The drive to the lake house was quiet but not tense. We listened to music, occasionally commenting on the traffic, the weather. He reached for my hand once, and I let him hold it. It felt familiar, like muscle memory. But not electric. Not alive. When we arrived, the house was just as we had left it months ago. Dusty, still, filled with remnants of our past vacations. I opened windows, letting in the crisp autumn air. He unpacked the groceries, placing them neatly in the fridge, humming an old song under his breath. That evening, we sat on the porch with blankets draped over our legs, sipping tea and watching the lake shimmer in the moonlight. It was peaceful. Serene. A picture-perfect moment. But I felt hollow in the center, like I was observing my life from outside a window, knocking on the glass with no one there to hear me. I miss us, he said suddenly. I looked over at him. His eyes were soft, honest. I don't know when we stopped being close. I swallowed, the words forming slowly. I think we stopped noticing each other. And then we stopped needing to. He didn't speak right away. When he did, his voice was lower. Do you want to try again? That question landed like a stone. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to be the woman who could say yes and mean it. But I didn't trust myself to answer. Can we just sit here a little longer? I said instead. He nodded. We didn't talk after that. The next morning, I woke early and took a walk by the lake. The water was calm, almost glass-like, and the world felt paused. I sat on a bench near the dock, wrapping my coat tighter around me. I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of pine and damp earth. I thought of the past few weeks, not just the kiss, not just the tension, but the slow unraveling of who I'd been and who I was becoming. I didn't know where it would lead. I only knew that the woman I was now couldn't go back to living half awake. When I returned to the cabin, he was making breakfast. Eggs, toast, coffee. Simple. He looked up and smiled. Sleep okay? Well enough, I answered. We ate together. Talked about mundane things, the plumbing, a neighbor's dog, the forecast. It was comfortable, if not entirely honest. That afternoon, we went for a short hike through the woods behind the house. The leaves crunched underfoot, and the path wound quietly through tall trees and moss-covered stones. At one point, I stopped to catch my breath, and he took a photo of me without asking. I smiled out of habit. Later, he showed me the picture. "You look thoughtful," he said. I nodded. "I've had a lot to think about." Back at the house, I took a nap on the couch while he read by the fireplace. When I woke, it was almost dark. The soft sound of pages turning was the only noise in the room. "I was thinking," he said without looking up, "we could make this a regular thing. Even once a month. Just us. Reconnect." I sat up, stretching slowly. Maybe. It wasn't a lie. It wasn't a promise either. That night, we played cards by candlelight, laughed over old stories, remembered things we'd forgotten. There were moments when it felt almost like before. But even in those moments, I felt the undercurrent of what remained unsaid. When we returned home the next day, everything looked the same. Nothing had changed, but everything had. I unpacked slowly, placing folded clothes back into drawers, restoring order. When I opened the closet, my fingers brushed against the gray dress again. I pulled it out, held it up to the light, and stared at it. It no longer felt like an invitation. It felt like a mirror. I hung it back, gently, and closed the door. Then I stood there, in the stillness of our bedroom, and listened to the quiet creak of footsteps below. Something was shifting. Not loudly. Not violently. But definitely. Undeniably. And I knew it wouldn't stay quiet forever. The following week arrived in fragments. Days passed like pages fluttering in a wind I couldn't stop, and each one left behind a residue I couldn't clean off. I returned to my routines, but they no longer fit. I was restless in ways I couldn't explain, even to myself. The lake house trip hadn't resolved anything, it had only magnified what was missing. Still, I played my part, quietly, efficiently, as I always had. It was a Thursday when I received the message. Just a name. No words, no context. Just his name, appearing on my phone like a thought I hadn't had in days. A small vibration, a subtle pulse in the palm of my hand, and suddenly everything that had settled began to rise again. I stared at the screen for a long time. I didn't respond. But I also didn't delete it. That evening, my husband had a late meeting. I didn't question it. He didn't offer details. We exchanged a brief kiss goodbye, and he left. The door clicked shut behind him, and silence returned like a familiar guest. I sat at the kitchen table, the gray dress laid out in front of me. I hadn't worn it. Not once. I had only touched it, smoothed its fabric with the edge of my palm, traced the seams like memory. But tonight, something compelled me. Not defiance. Not even longing. Just inevitability. I changed slowly, carefully, slipping the fabric over my shoulders, adjusting the waist. It fit perfectly, as if measured not just for my body but for this moment. I looked at myself in the mirror. The reflection didn't surprise me. It didn't even feel foreign. It simply felt true. I left the house before I had time to think too much. I didn't leave a note. I didn't make excuses. I simply left. The drive was quiet, the streets half empty, the world dimming into evening. I kept the windows up and the music off. My hands on the steering wheel were steady. My thoughts, less so. When I pulled into the driveway of the workshop, I paused. The lights were off, the front door closed. For a moment, I wondered if this was a mistake. But then the porch light flickered on, as if sensing me. I stepped out, locked the car, and walked up the steps. He opened the door before I knocked. He looked at me for a moment, really looked, and then stepped aside. I walked in without a word. The room was as I remembered it. The same tools, the same smell, the same warmth that always seemed to linger no matter the season. But something felt different now. Not the space. Me. I turned toward him, unsure of what I meant to say, but he didn't speak either. There was no need. The silence between us said enough. And then, we spent the night together. That is all I will say. When the morning came, it was gray outside, soft rain tapping against the windows like distant thoughts. I sat on the edge of the small cot tucked against the far wall, the blanket still wrapped around my shoulders. The air was cool, quiet, unhurried. He moved through the space quietly, making tea, folding a blanket, restoring a sense of order without disturbing the calm. There was no urgency between us, no declarations, no expectations. Just a mutual understanding that the lines we once tiptoed around had been crossed. I dressed in silence. The gray dress was still smooth, still unwrinkled, as if it too had decided not to speak of the night. When I turned to face him, he met my eyes and simply nodded. A gesture heavy with meaning but light in form. I stepped outside. The rain was light, almost mist. I walked to my car without rushing, climbed inside, and sat for a long time before turning the key. The drive home felt like moving backward through time. The farther I got, the more layers I put back on, roles, routines, the masks I wore so naturally. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I was back in costume. But I wasn't the same. Inside, the house was still. My husband wasn't home yet. A note on the counter said he'd gone for groceries. I read it twice, then placed it back exactly where I found it. I changed out of the gray dress, folded it neatly, and placed it on the top shelf of the closet. I didn't bury it, but I didn't leave it out either. It was real. But not public. Later that day, we had dinner together. He talked about his meeting, a colleague's divorce, the rise in mortgage rates. I nodded, made sounds of interest, passed him the salt. He didn't notice anything different. Or if he did, he didn't ask. And I didn't offer. That night, I lay awake beside him, listening to the sound of the rain returning. My body felt still, but my mind was not. I turned toward the window, watching the light reflections ripple across the glass. There was no regret. But there was a heaviness. Not sorrow. Not guilt. Just the knowledge that nothing would be quite the same again, not because of what happened, but because of what it had revealed. About me. About my needs. About the silences I had accepted for too long. Eventually, I closed my eyes. Sleep came slowly. But it came. The days after passed in fragments, like broken pieces of glass that didn't quite fit back into their original frame. I returned to my routines, laundry, errands, brief conversations with neighbors, but something essential had shifted within me. I was no longer pretending. Not to myself, at least. That part had become irreversible. There was no confrontation, no fallout, no discovery. Only silence. The silence of knowing, of carrying a truth that wouldn't rest but also wouldn't scream. I had changed the course of something, and I was waiting to see where it would lead. At home, things with my husband fell into an uneasy rhythm. He had become more present, but also more cautious. I sensed he was watching me, not suspiciously, but curiously, as if he too had felt the subtle unraveling of something, yet couldn't put his finger on the thread. We cooked together one evening, chopping vegetables side by side like we had done many times before. He commented on a recipe his sister had sent. I smiled, nodded, asked the right questions. But there was a distance between us, not physical, but perceptual. He saw me, but not fully. And I let him see only what I knew he could handle. Later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I tried to remember the last time I had wanted something purely for myself, not for approval, not for stability, not for peacekeeping. Just for me. The memory wouldn't come. Or maybe it never existed. I began taking long walks again, something I hadn't done in months. I wandered neighborhoods I didn't know, watched strangers through lit windows, imagined their lives, their dinners, their silences. It gave me a sense of connection without obligation. One afternoon, as I passed a small bookstore tucked between a cafe and a tailor's shop, I stopped. Something about the storefront pulled me in. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old pages and wood polish. I browsed aimlessly, running my fingers along spines, pausing occasionally to flip through pages I had no intention of buying. Eventually, I found myself in a far corner where the poetry books were kept. I picked up a slim volume with a torn cover and opened to a random page. The words weren't grand or lyrical, they were quiet, precise, familiar in their ache. I read them once, then again, and then closed the book and bought it without hesitation. That night, I read from it in bed, the lamp casting a warm circle of light around me while my husband slept. There was a particular line that clung to me: we do not always choose the doors we open. Sometimes, they choose us. I reread it until it no longer felt like ink on paper, but breath. A few days later, I saw her. It was at the grocery store. I was in line at the pharmacy, waiting to pick up a refill for my husband, when I noticed a woman several feet away, checking her phone. She was younger than me, maybe mid-30s. But it wasn't her age that held my attention. It was her face. The eyes. The shape of her mouth. I stared longer than I should have, certain I was mistaken. But then she looked up. Our eyes met. She tilted her head slightly, almost like a question, and then offered a polite smile. I returned it, though mine felt delayed. She returned her gaze to her phone, and the moment passed. But I knew. I paid for the prescription and walked to my car in a daze, my hands trembling slightly as I unlocked the door. I sat there for a long time, engine off, the bag resting in the passenger seat. My mind was racing, not with panic, but with certainty. I didn't call him. I didn't want confirmation. I didn't need it. Back home, I placed the medicine on the counter and went to my room. I opened the closet, pulled down the old box of photos and letters I hadn't touched in years, and sat on the floor sorting through it. Near the bottom, folded neatly inside a yellowing envelope, was a photograph I remembered well. Him, standing beside a woman I never met. The same woman from the workshop photo. Her hand on his arm. Her smile small, quiet. Next to her, barely in the frame, a little girl. Same eyes. Same tilt of the head. The girl from the store. I had carried that truth in the back of my mind for years, unopened but not forgotten. Now it was fully awake. I thought of going back to the workshop. Asking questions. Making sense of it all. But I didn't. Because it wasn't about answers anymore. It was about understanding the weight we all carry. The things we never say out loud. The decisions made in silence, rippling through lives like invisible currents. That night, my husband asked if I wanted to invite our daughter over for dinner that weekend. He missed her, he said. So did I. We texted her together, deciding on a Sunday evening. The conversation felt natural, easy, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to enjoy the simplicity of that plan. One dinner. One evening of familiar roles. I could do that. Later, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed the poetry book still open on my nightstand. Another line caught my eye: to be seen is not the same as being known. I closed the book slowly and turned off the light. I lay down beside him. He reached for my hand in the dark. I let him hold it. Not because I was trying to go back, but because I still hadn't decided where I was going. And sometimes, stillness isn't surrender. It's the breath before movement. The morning of the dinner arrived with a strange stillness, as if the air itself had paused in anticipation. I moved through the house quietly, setting the table, slicing vegetables, arranging flowers from the garden in a small ceramic vase. My hands moved with practiced familiarity, yet my mind felt detached, hovering somewhere outside the walls of our home. Our daughter was due to arrive around 5. She had confirmed with a short message the night before, looking forward to it. Need anything? I had told her no, everything was handled. It wasn't just about the food or the preparations. It was about giving shape to something that had slowly unraveled over time. Maybe it was just a dinner. Maybe it was something more. My husband was unusually helpful that morning, sweeping the porch, restocking the fridge, double-checking if we had her favorite wine. He didn't speak much, but there was a softness in his movements, a kind of quiet offering I didn't know how to receive. By late afternoon, the house was clean and warm, filled with the scent of roasted herbs and simmering sauce. I had dressed simply but deliberately, in a navy blouse and soft gray trousers. Nothing dramatic, but intentional. When the doorbell rang, my breath caught for a moment. Not from nerves, but from a quiet awareness that time had passed faster than I realized. I opened the door and there she was, our daughter, arms full of a small paper bag and a bottle of wine, cheeks pink from the cold. She looked like both of us and neither of us. She had his steadiness, my eyes, and a presence entirely her own. She hugged me tightly, then stepped inside, slipping off her coat with ease. Dinner unfolded gently. We spoke about her work, her new apartment, a trip she was planning with friends. My husband asked questions, laughed at her stories. I watched them both, half participant, half observer, marveling at the ease of it all. And yet, beneath that surface, I felt a soft tremor, something unspoken vibrating faintly in my chest. At one point, while clearing plates, she followed me into the kitchen and leaned against the counter. "You okay?" she asked, quietly. I turned to her, wiping my hands on a towel. "Why wouldn't I be?" She shrugged. "You just seem quieter than usual." I smiled gently. "Maybe I'm just listening more." She watched me for a moment, then nodded, satisfied with the answer, or willing to leave it alone. We had dessert, something she had brought from a bakery near her apartment. My husband poured coffee. We sat in the living room, the fire crackling low, wrapped in the kind of comfort that only long relationships can hold. I almost believed we were untouched. But I knew better. After she left, we stood at the door for a long time, watching her taillights disappear into the evening. My husband closed the door slowly, then turned to me. He looked tired, but not from the evening, from everything. "I liked tonight," he said. It felt normal. I nodded, unsure what to say. He looked at me for a moment longer, then walked to the kitchen to start the dishes. I stood alone in the hallway for a while, staring at the door, then turned and went upstairs. Later that night, after the kitchen was clean and the house was quiet, I sat on the edge of our bed, brushing my hair slowly. My husband was already under the covers, reading something on his phone, the screen casting a soft glow across his face. I didn't ask what he was reading. I didn't say anything at all. I placed the brush down and turned off the light. I lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the house, the creak of the wood, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint shifting of fabric beside me. My thoughts wandered, not to the night we had spent together, not to the girl in the store, not even to the gray dress still hanging in the closet. They wandered to a deeper place, to the part of me that had always craved stillness but never learned how to live inside it. The next morning, I rose before him. I made coffee, fed the cat, watched the sunrise through the window above the sink. The light came slowly, painting the kitchen in soft gold. It was beautiful. It was ordinary. As I stood there, sipping from my mug, I thought about what it meant to carry a secret, not as a weapon or a burden, but as something internal, personal, deeply woven into the fabric of one's being. Not all secrets are loud. Some live in silence, shaping the choices we make, the words we don't say, the people we become. I didn't plan what I did next. I just found myself driving. The route was familiar now, automatic. I pulled into the driveway without thinking, parked, and sat in the car for several minutes, watching the front door like it might open on its own. It didn't. Eventually, I got out and knocked. He answered almost immediately, like he had been waiting. He stepped aside without speaking. I walked in. The workshop was quieter than usual. The tools were arranged neatly. The work table was cleared. A chair had been pulled out for me. I sat. We didn't speak for several minutes. The silence wasn't heavy. It was filled with recognition. I saw her, I said finally. At the pharmacy. I didn't approach her. But I knew. He nodded slowly, not surprised. I figured you might. I looked down at my hands. Why didn't you ever tell me? I didn't think it would change anything, he said. And maybe I didn't want to see myself through your eyes when you knew. I let those words settle. I wasn't judging you, I said. I just didn't expect to feel what I felt. What did you feel? I don't know. Everything. Nothing. Guilt. Curiosity. Loss. He nodded again. There was a long pause. I didn't come here to ask you for anything, I continued. I just wanted you to know. I understand more than I thought I would. He reached for a small wooden box on the shelf behind him and handed it to me. I opened it. Inside was a stack of letters, neatly folded, tied with a faded ribbon. I didn't need to read them. I understood what they were. Keep them, he said. Or burn them. Or do nothing. They're yours now. I took the box and held it in my lap. It felt heavier than it looked. I stood to leave. He didn't stop me. At the door, I turned once more. We can't go back, I said. I know. I left without another word. The drive home was slow. Thoughtful. I took the long way, winding through streets I hadn't traveled in years. I thought about the dinner, my daughter's quiet question, the way my husband had smiled at the table. I thought about the letters, their faded edges, their silent truths. When I arrived home, the house was still. I placed the box on the hallway table, beside my keys. Then I walked into the living room and sat down. Not to explain. Not to confess. Just to be still. To listen. To decide. There's a moment in every story where the turning point has already passed, but the weight of its consequences hasn't fully settled. I was living in that space now. Not in crisis, not in clarity, just a quiet state of after. After the kiss, after the silence, after the night. After the recognition of a life divided by a choice I didn't make with logic but with some buried instinct that surfaced without warning. The box of letters remained untouched on the hallway table for several days. Each time I passed it, I felt its presence like an echo, calling, but not demanding. I couldn't bring myself to open them. Not yet. Not because I was afraid of what was inside, but because I was afraid of what they might confirm, that I had only seen a fragment of him all these years. Or worse, that I had never truly seen him at all. I began writing again. Nothing formal. Just thoughts in a notebook I kept hidden in my dresser. I didn't write about what happened, not directly, but the pages filled with observations, details, small emotions that never made it into conversation. It felt like pouring water into dry soil, watching something move beneath the surface, waiting for it to bloom or crack. My husband had grown quieter, too. We weren't in conflict, but we weren't in sync. We lived in parallel, brushing shoulders, trading logistics, sharing meals. But the intimacy that once existed, however subtly, had been replaced with cautious kindness. A gentleness that bordered on distance. I could see him searching for the right words, as if afraid any question might open something he wasn't ready to confront. One evening, I found him standing by the window, staring out at the yard. He looked smaller somehow, like the man I married had aged in weeks, not years. He didn't turn when I entered, but he spoke. "Do you think we'll come back from this?" His voice wasn't accusing. It was uncertain, quiet. I stood there for a moment before answering. "I don't know." He nodded, as if that answer hurt but made sense. "I've been trying," he said. "To do more. To be more. But I don't know if I'm just too late." "You're not too late," I replied. "But I'm not sure I'm still the same person." He finally turned, eyes heavy. "Neither am I." We stood there, facing each other, two people shaped by years of quiet compromise and unspoken longing. No argument. No apology. Just the quiet ache of honesty. That night, I didn't sleep. Again. I lay in bed thinking about the girl at the pharmacy, the woman in the photo, the child never spoken of. I thought about the night we spent together, the look in his eyes afterward, the silence we had both accepted as protection. By morning, I knew I needed to see him one last time. Not for closure. For clarity. The drive felt different this time. Not filled with anticipation, but with finality. I parked outside and sat for a while, watching the workshop through the windshield. The door was open. The light inside was warm. Inviting. But I didn't move. Eventually, he came out, as if sensing I was there. He didn't wave or call. He just stood on the porch, waiting. I stepped out and walked slowly toward him. Inside, the room was unchanged. The work table still held fabric and sketches. A half-finished coat lay across the corner. I didn't ask who it was for. We sat, as we always had, in silence. Then I spoke. "I'm not here to ask why. Or even to explain." He nodded. "I know. I just need you to understand something." His eyes met mine. "I didn't come to you because I was looking for escape. I came to you because you were the only person who ever made me feel seen without having to perform." His expression didn't change, but something softened in his posture. "You gave me that once," I continued. "But I can't stay there. Not in memory. Not in what we became. I need to live forward now. Whatever that means." He didn't argue. He didn't reach for me. He just looked down, then back up. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "No," I said. "But I don't want to relive it either. I want to grow from it. I want to become someone who no longer needs to disappear to feel real." He smiled faintly, almost sadly. "You were always real to me." I stood. "Then let me go." He didn't stop me. On the drive home, I felt something unravel. Not in grief, but in relief. The kind that comes when you finally tell the truth, even if it changes nothing. Even if it changes everything. Back at the house, I found my husband in the kitchen, chopping vegetables. The simplicity of the moment grounded me. I walked over, gently placed a hand on his back. He turned, surprised, but didn't pull away. "I need to tell you something," I said. He looked at me carefully, as if bracing for impact. "I made a choice," I continued. Not to betray you, but to find something I had lost in myself. And I think you felt it too, how far I drifted. His jaw tensed. Did you? Yes, I said, sparing him the weight of asking. He looked down at the cutting board, then back at me. Is it over? Yes, I said again. He set the knife down and leaned against the counter. He didn't shout. He didn't cry. He just breathed, slow and deep. I don't know what to do with that, he said finally. You don't have to do anything now, I said. But I needed you to know. Because if we're going to rebuild anything, it has to start with truth. He nodded slowly. Then, almost imperceptibly, he reached for my hand. We stood there in silence. Not reconciled. Not broken. Just together. And maybe that was enough, for now.